The Romans never called it the Colosseum. To them, it was the Amphitheatrum Flavium, a public arena raised by a ruling family determined to erase the memory of a tyrant and replace it with permanence. The name Colosseum emerged centuries later, drawn from a colossal statue of Nero that once towered nearby. The statue vanished, the empire collapsed, but the building remained, not because it was admired, but because it was engineered to endure. To understand the building, you must understand the ground beneath it. This valley was once stolen land. After the Great Fire of Rome, Emperor Nero seized the heart of the city for himself. He built the Domus Aurea, a private paradise of artificial lakes and marble halls, barring the people from their own capital. When Nero fell, Rome demanded restitution. Emperor Vespasian, a pragmatic soldier, did not just build a monument, he performed an act of political healing. He drained the tyrant's private lake, he scrubbed away the luxury, and right where an emperor once played, he built a house where the public could sit. It was not just built in Rome, it was built for Rome. Construction began around 72 AD. Vespasian was a practical soldier emperor. He had little interest in luxury, but a profound understanding of power. The project was financed by the spoils of war, gold and silver ripped from the temples of Jerusalem during the brutal Eastern campaigns. But Vespasian would not live to see his vision realized. That honor fell to his son Titus, who inaugurated the arena in 80 AD. Later, his brother Domitian would dig deep to expand the world beneath the floor. 3 emperors, 1 structure, each adding a layer to its purpose and its complexity. Before a single stone was cut, Roman surveyors walked onto the waterlogged earth and turned chaos into geometry. Using simple chords, stakes, and sighting instruments, they traced a perfect elliptical boundary, nearly 190 meters long. This shape was not an artistic choice. It was a machine. An ellipse allowed for maximum visibility and the fluid movement of crowds, critical for a vessel designed to hold 50,000 souls. Precision came first. The monument followed. The engineering challenge was immense. The soil was treacherous, still soft from Nero's drained lake. To conquer it, engineers dug deep, packing the earth with over 12 meters of opus cementitium, Roman concrete. This was no ordinary mixture. Combining lime, stone, and volcanic ash, Roman concrete does not just dry, it creates a chemical bond that grows stronger over centuries. The Colosseum's true strength lies not in the arches we see today, but in the concrete buried beneath our feet. The Colosseum is a triumph of engineering, but it is also a graveyard of effort. Skilled architects designed the curves, engineers calculated the crushing loads, but it was thousands of enslaved laborers, many drawn from the defeated provinces of Judea, who performed the brutal reality of construction. They hauled, they lifted, they dug. Every block of stone is a testament to Roman glory and a reminder of the empire's human cost. The walls of the Colosseum did not begin in Rome. They began 20 miles away in the scorched, sulphurous hills of Tivoli, ancient Tibur. Here lay the vast deposits of travertine, a sedimentary limestone formed by mineral springs. It is a stone chosen for its ability to bear immense loads and its stark, white beauty. But extracting it was a monumental task. Workers used a technique called plug and feather, driving iron wedges into the rock to split it away from the cliff face. These were not small bricks. The largest blocks weighed nearly 5 tons. It was mass production on a scale the ancient world had never seen. The quarries at Albulae became a scene of constant, deafening industry, operating from dawn until dusk. Stones were extracted, roughly shaped into cubes and marked with letters and numbers, part of a sophisticated logistical system ensuring that every piece had a specific destination before it even left the ground. This was the first step in a supply chain that would consume over 100,000 cubic meters of stone. The journey from the quarry to the city centre was slow, relentless, and a logistical nightmare. To transport the travertine, the Romans built a dedicated road, the Via Tiburtina, which was widened and heavily reinforced to withstand the crushing traffic. Day after day, unbroken lines of heavy-duty carts, pulled by teams of oxen, groaned toward the capital. But roads alone were not enough. The Romans utilized the Aniene River, a tributary of the Tiber, to float the heaviest materials on reinforced barges, letting the current do the work that muscle could not. Once they reached the docks of Rome, the stone had to be hauled through the teeming, narrow streets of the city to the construction site. This operation required military-grade coordination. Rome's infrastructure, its network of paved roads, its stone bridges, its river ports, turned the impossible into the routine. We often think of Rome as an empire of soldiers and swords, but it was above all an empire of logistics. At the construction site, the skyline was dominated by wooden cranes, skeletal towers rising above the dust and noise. These machines, known as polyspastos, were powered by human muscle. Men walked inside massive wooden tread wheels, converting their body weight into lifting power. As the wheels turned, ropes tightened through complex pulley systems, magnifying the force and allowing a handful of men to lift tons of rock. Once the stones were hoisted into place, there was often no mortar used to hold the main load-bearing pillars. Instead, the blocks were honed to a perfect fit and locked together using massive iron clamps, sealed with molten lead. These clamps effectively stapled the building together, relying on gravity and absolute precision to stand. Over 300 tons of iron were used for these clamps alone. Although most were gouged out by scavengers in the Middle Ages, leaving the pockmarks we see today, the stones they once held remain, balanced by the genius of the arch, a shape that carries weight away from weakness and down into the earth. As the Colosseum rose, it did not just grow in height, it evolved in style. The outer facade was composed of 4 distinct tiers, totaling nearly 50 meters in height. Roman architects used the orders of architecture to create a visual hierarchy that the eye could read like a book. The ground floor utilized the Doric order, or Tuscan, sturdy, simple columns representing strength, capable of bearing the most weight. Above that, the second tier featured Ionic columns, lighter, with scroll-like volutes. The third tier displayed the Corinthian order, ornate, flowery, and refined, representing the pinnacle of artistic achievement. This progression was not merely decoration. It was Rome expressing control, imposing a rational order upon a massive volume of stone. At the very summit, a solid wall featured mast corbels that anchored the velarium, a vast, retractable awning operated by sailors from the Roman navy. This canvas sky shield protected the spectators from the blistering Italian sun, turning the open-air arena into a shaded theatre. Inside the arena, the cavea, seating area, was a mirror of Roman society itself. To sit in the Colosseum was to know exactly where you stood in the hierarchy of the world. The seating was strictly segregated by law. The emperor and the Vestal virgins had their own private boxes at the north and south ends. The senatorial class sat on the Iama cavea, the marble steps closest to the action, where they could see the sweat and blood of the combatants. Above them sat the equestrians, knights, and higher still were the ordinary male citizens. At the very top, in the steep wooden bleachers known as the Summa Cavea, sat the women and the poor, the furthest from power. Despite this rigid separation, the movement of the crowd was fluid. The amphitheater was designed with 80 numbered entrances and a complex system of corridors and staircases called vomitoria. This design allowed 50,000 people to flood in or evacuate the building in mere minutes, a feat of crowd control that modern stadiums still struggle to match. The focus of all this attention was the arena floor, an oval measuring 87 by 55 meters. The word arena itself comes from the Latin harina, meaning sand. This was the surface that the audience saw, a thick layer of sand, often dyed red to look dramatic or mingled with glittering minerals. But the sand served a grim, practical purpose. It was there to provide traction for the fighters, and crucially, to absorb the massive amounts of blood spilled during the games. The floor was made of wooden panels that could be removed or reconfigured. To the spectator in the stands, the floor was the stage where myths were enacted and justice was dealt. But the floor was also a mask. It concealed the machinery, it baffled the sound of the preparations below, and it separated the clean, ordered world of the Roman citizen above from the dark, chaotic underworld of the beast and the gladiator below. What the audience saw was the spectacle. What they were protected from was the industrial preparation of death. Under Emperor Domitian, the simple underground trenches were expanded into the Hypogeum, literally the underground. This was the backstage of the Colosseum, a two-story labyrinth of narrow corridors, animal cages, armories, and mechanical lifts. It was hot, noisy, and stank of wild animals and fear. Yet it was a marvel of engineering. Here, in the stifling dark, hundreds of stagehands worked capstans and winches to operate a system of dozens of elevators. These lifts could hoist heavy cages containing lions, bears, or tigers up to the surface, where trapdoors would snap open, releasing the beasts into the arena as if they had appeared by magic. Other mechanisms could deploy scenery, trees, rocks, and hills, transforming the flat sand into a forest or a desert in moments. The Colosseum became a machine capable of surprise, control, and terrifying illusion, ensuring that the crowd was never bored and always in awe of the emperor's reach. The events held within these walls, gladiatorial combat, wild animal hunts, venation, and public executions, are often dismissed today as mere bloodlust, but to the Romans they were something far more significant. They were ritualized displays of cosmic order and imperial authority. The day followed a strict script: beast hunts in the morning to show dominance over nature, executions at noon to show the inevitable destruction of those who broke Roman law, and gladiatorial combat in the afternoon to demonstrate martial virtue and bravery. These were not random acts of violence. They were political theatre. The games distracted the populace from famine or war, reinforced the social hierarchy, and provided a safety valve for the city's aggression. The message broadcast to the 50,000 spectators was clear and uncompromising. Rome controlled the wild. Rome controlled the barbarian. Rome held the power of life and death in its fist. It was propaganda written in blood. History is unkind to the works of man. Empires fall. Bronze is melted down for weapons. Marble is stripped to build churches and palaces. The Colosseum itself was used as a quarry for centuries. Its stones helped build St. Peter's Basilica and the Palazzo Venezia. Earthquakes have shaken these walls for 2,000 years, shattering the southern side, and yet the Colosseum endures. It stands not because of the myths attached to it, nor the legends of martyrs. It stands because the Roman engineers understood a timeless truth. They did not just pile stone upon stone. They mastered the materials. They respected the geometry of the arch, and they understood the flow of forces and human movement. The Colosseum is a survivor. It is a hollowed-out skull of an empire, staring blankly at the modern world. A reminder that if you build with absolute conviction and engineering mastery, you can create something that outlives the gods, the emperors, and the power that created it.